You're listening to Real Talk Texas with local expert Steve Hakes. Now, here's Steve.
Welcome back. Today in the studio here on Real Talk Texas, we've got Gerrit Pronsky of Pronsky & Patel in our studio, and he's here to give us real advice about debt elimination and restructuring. So now we're going to move on to an area that may affect a lot of our listeners out there that own a small business, and some areas that they may need to know about. What are their options? They've been facing some tough times. They've had cash flow issues. Maybe they've got employees that work for them. They're really the heart blood of America, those small business owners. What are the options? How does someone get started? They call you up, Gerrit, and they say, look, I'm in trouble. I can't pay my bills. I've got these certain debts I haven't paid. I'm trying to make payroll. How do you help them?
Well, Steve, it really depends a lot on the specifics of the business. But I think one of the things that we look at primarily or look at when somebody first comes in is we try to look at whether a business has viability going forward, or whether it's something that just basically needs to be liquidated. And that gives us our basic bankruptcy options of whether we file a Chapter 11 bankruptcy to try to restructure the debt, or whether the business is, if it doesn't have any viability, whether it's just going to go into a Chapter 7 basically and liquidate. In the market that we have today, the economy that we have today, we are seeing a lot of lenders that are more interested in working things out of bankruptcy than I think we've seen historically. And I think a lot of that is because lenders, they don't want properties back as badly as they used to. Interest rates are much lower. And for a variety of reasons, we're finding the non-bankruptcy approach to be something that we always try to look at to see if something is available to restructure outside of bankruptcy. But if a bankruptcy option is necessary for a business, it's going to essentially be Chapter 11, which is a restructure of the debt, or a Chapter 7, which is a liquidation. Okay,
so for the average listener out there that's maybe a first-time business owner, they've put their heart into their business, they've got employees they love like family, I'm sure it's a very, very difficult time. I've talked to some business owners that say, when I was building my business, it was great. A friend of mine told me that, everybody here can leave except for you. They can all find new jobs except for you. And all of a sudden, maybe as a corporate exec before, and now he's got a business, and he's sitting there and he's thinking, well, how do I unwind this thing, or how do I get out of this? And I'm sure it's overwhelming. And would that be an area where you would step in and kind of give that evaluation about viability and really an outsider's point of view of his business?
Yeah, I think that's a real good point. And we can do that as bankruptcy lawyers. We can do that from the standpoint of imposing the bankruptcy laws on this particular situation to see what it would look like if it were in a bankruptcy. For example, in a business situation, a company may be completely underwater and struggling because of the debt load that it has, but it might be profitable from an operational standpoint. In other words, it has the ability to make money, but it's got so much debt.
So maybe they got lines of credit out there that they have, or maybe they owe vendors or suppliers. Is that the kind of debt you're talking about?
Exactly. Or it might be a one-time debt situation, maybe a judgment that they've just gotten against them for some kind of an injury or something that has caused a substantial debt that keeps the company from being able to be viable from a debt standpoint. But maybe it's a good business that's viable and should continue to operate, but just has that one particular situation. Or it might be they've gotten behind with their payroll taxes, and there's all kinds of liabilities and problems associated with that. So we can take a look at a business and we can see whether if we file a bankruptcy, whether and when we do file a bankruptcy, regardless of what chapter it's in, the collection efforts against the company come to a halt as of the filing of the bankruptcy. It's called the automatic stay, and it's one of the biggest protections that you have going into a bankruptcy, is that basically you sort of put all of the debt that exists as of the bankruptcy filing on the shelf, and nobody can do anything to collect that debt while you sort of sort things through, determine whether you can be profitable operationally, and figure out a way then to come out of bankruptcy with that pre-bankruptcy debt restructured in a way that's manageable.
Okay, so if you're listening out there and you're not really sure what restructuring is, what does that mean, restructure? I mean, does that mean a forgiveness of some debt or a lowering of interest rate, or how do you restructure?
Good question, and really the answer is all of the above. A restructure is really a creative process that encompasses sometimes eliminating a portion of the debt. Sometimes it pays it out over a longer period of time. Sometimes it reduces the interest rate. So it really depends on the situation. The bankruptcy laws are designed basically to do what makes sense. One of the overarching or overriding principles of bankruptcy law is you're trying to preserve a going concern, make sure creditors are protected. But the idea is that this going concern has more value in the long run than its parts through a liquidation. So the alternatives to restructuring are pretty creative, and sometimes they require that you have to eliminate some debt, and sometimes it's just paying it out over a longer period of time.
Well, and I always, I'm sure this affects large businesses too. I mean, General Motors is going through some things themselves, and maybe should have gone into bankruptcy according to some of our politicians. But when I think of business, I think of the heartland. I think of the small business owner, and some business owners that I'm friends with, they're not even LLCs. They're just doing business under their own name. And so I worry about them as far as how are they protected, or how somebody with an LLC, are they really protected on their personal assets, like in Texas, or their home or their personal bank accounts? If can creditors, when you're doing all this negotiation about what can you really repay, are they able to reach across the business into the family's assets?
Right, and that's something that we look at, and there's usually pretty clear answers to those questions that you're raising, and they're good questions. In a structure like an LLC or a corporation, or in those types of entities, there is a protection for the owners so that they're not, as a general rule, they're not liable for the debts of the entity. Now, there's some variations on that. For example, in a small business situation, a lot of times the owners of the company are forced to guarantee the debt, for example, to the bank. So it might be a corporate debt, but if you're guaranteed on it, then you've got a personal problem, obviously. So in that circumstance, we have to look at restructuring the company debt, but you can win the battle and lose the war, because if you've restructured the company debt, and that means that you've created a huge guarantee deficiency against the owner, then you've lost the war. So there are things like that we have to look at.
Yeah, and I see that sometimes as a mortgage lender. I'll talk to people and they have a bankruptcy, and I see that they always paid everything on time, but then they have this bankruptcy, and what happened? And most of the time it's they've owned a business went into bankruptcy, they had an LLC, but they personally guaranteed everything. So it really didn't matter if they were an LLC or not, because they still were able to reach across with that personal guarantee and ask them to repay it. It would have, so they've drugged the family into bankruptcy as well.
Right.
So,
did you want to go through some of the personal protections?
Well, I think we live in Texas, right? Yeah. And so this is a Real Talk Texas show. And if you've just tuned in, you're listening to Real Talk Texas. We've got a real expert in our studio today. We've got Gerrit Pronsky, and he is a specialist in bankruptcy. He's been doing it for a long, long time, and he's even written a book on bankruptcy laws in Texas here for other attorneys to study. So with that said, what makes it different? How are we more protected here in Texas? I think we were talking before. Tell our listeners about why it's so great to be in Texas.
What we were talking about specifically is exemption laws. When I say exemption, that means these are laws that make certain type of assets or properties not available to general creditors. So, for example, one way that Texas is very unique, Texas has what's considered the most liberal creditor protection exemption laws of any state in the United States. There are only 2 states, for example, that have unlimited homestead protections, Texas and Florida, where you can have literally a $10 million house, and it's the creditors other than your mortgage creditor can't touch that house. But some of the unique laws in Texas, and even if you file a bankruptcy proceeding, which is federal law, you can elect to take these Texas exemptions. And some of those things that are unique, as we've talked about, are the homestead, which allows you to protect a home from creditors in an unlimited dollar amount. If there's a bankruptcy filed, there's some limitations on that if a bankruptcy is filed that are kind of to complicated to go into with a short segment here, but homestead law is very, very liberal in Texas. Texas has a very unique law that protects the cash surrender value of life insurance policies and annuities. So you can purchase in Texas, for example, a $5 million single premium annuity, and that would be exempt from creditors. Again, some exceptions. For example, if you bought that annuity in fraud of creditors, you don't get the protection. But if this is an annuity you've had for a long, long time, that's protected from creditors.
Well, it sounds like you're definitely the person to call. And we're going to talk in our next segment more about beyond the business side. So we're going to jump the fence over into the personal arena. And we're going to talk about if you're in that situation, how do you prepare for it? And we were talking before the show about a lot of people, it's best to prepare to go into bankruptcy. That way you can come out of it okay. So if you're listening out there, stay tuned because we're going to have some real tips for you if you're in that situation. And we're really happy today to have Gerrit Pronsky in our studio, so stay tuned.